Hi guys, welcome to part one. Okay, so in this video, we are going to take a closer look at the fabrics that we're going to work with, the needles that are required to successfully sew with those types of fabrics, pins, and whether you should pin or not pin, as well as cutting out techniques for your patterns and the pattern placement with the fabric type. All right, let's get started. In front of us right here, we have a variety of supplies that are helpful for successfully sewing with these types of fabrics. So from left to right, we have a clear acrylic ruler. This has 1/8 inch markings on it, which is great for measuring out or adding to seam allowances. We use this alongside a rotary cutter on a self-healing cutting mat. And then we also have a very sharp pair of embroidery trimming scissors. So this is great for cutting in very delicate fabrics or trimming threads really close to the fabric edge. Then we also have some freezer paper, which we use to stabilize the back side of fabric. This is helpful for the cutting out process. And here we have fray check, which we use to seal edges of chiffon type fabrics. This helps with fraying. We have tailor's chalk that we use to mark the outline of pattern pieces when the fabric doesn't work well with pinning. And then we have some sharp, small hand sewing needles. These are great for all the finish work on these types of fabrics. And then we have sewing machine needles. So the recommended type of needle that I would use the most is this Microtex sharp needle in a size 70-10. If you can find a size 60, that is good too, but this is my go-to. I also have a larger size just in case I'm working with a fabric that has a little bit more resistance in it. It's a little bit stronger fabric than this larger 90-14 or an 80-12 works great too. Now, a lot of these fabrics can also use universal needles. You just want to make sure that you're always starting with a fresh, sharp needle, and you can test it out on a swatch first to see if when that needle pokes through the fabric, if it's pulling or snagging that fabric at all. So I have some of these up here. These are universal needles in a 68. And I have a multi-pack of universal needles, stretch needles, jean needles. It gives me a variety of types of needles for different uses, and sometimes I can use those as well. Now we also have some fusible interfacing for knits, and this is great. It comes in handy on some of these delicate types of fabrics to give a little bit more stability and structure to the pieces. This is also great for sewing with knits. I use this a lot. It is a very good resource to have on hand all the time. And then we also have some tracing paper. You can use tracing paper, graph paper, any type of paper to use on your pattern pieces to open them up so that you're not cutting on a fold. A lot of these types of fabrics are very shifty. So if you're trying to line up a chiffon fabric and you have it cut on the fold for like a bodice front, that can be problematic. So I would recommend taking your pattern piece and then cutting it on a piece of paper that's cut on the fold so that you have a mirrored piece and you have a whole entire flat pattern piece to place on your fabric. So now that we have all of these tools ready and on hand, we're going to move on to working with the different types of fabric. Here we have a piece of chiffon fabric, and you can see it's pretty shifty. So the pattern will shift around. If I pull on it slightly, you can see that it moves quite a bit. So I'm going to take this piece of fabric and some freezer paper. Now you can see right here, freezer paper is dull on one side and then shiny on the other side. So this side that has this sheen is the side that will stick to the fabric when we press it down. So I'm simply going to take my fabric, I'm going to place my freezer paper just big enough to cut out all the pieces that I want to cut out. I'm placing this shiny side down on the wrong side of my fabric, and then I'm just lightly pressing this to adhere. So you can see right here, I did that very lightly because I'm actually on my cutting board, but that, even with just a little bit of heat, sticks to that fabric. So here I have a piece of fabric where I've pressed this paper down evenly all the way around. And this is large enough to cut out my front and back bodice. So I'm working with just this portion of fabric stabilized with the freezer paper. So I'm just gonna flip this over, and you can see here that we have a nice smooth piece of fabric. Then I'm just going to position my pattern pieces where I want them, and this comes in handy. It's very helpful if you have a print that is stripes, checks, or more systematic dots, and you really want them to go across the garment evenly or line up at the side seams. So there's no shifting that's going to happen once we cut these out. Now I'm just going to position these on here, and I can either pin them all the way through both the freezer paper and the fabric, or I can, depending on how big they are, I can hold them and just simply cut the edges with my rotary cutter as I'm holding them down. Now I like using the rotary cutter on this type of fabric, even with the stabilizer, because you're not lifting it up. When you start lifting this up to cut out with scissors, then the fabric is moving quite a bit, and it's hard to get it to cut exactly along the lines of the pattern piece. So here you can see we have this back piece cut out, and I'm just going to take the pins out, and then I can just peel off this freezer paper, and then I have my piece cut out exactly along grain and on the lines of my pattern piece. Now I would test out this technique on a small portion of your fabric before applying heat and the paper to a whole piece of fabric to make sure that it doesn't affect your fabric or melt the fabric in any way. Some fabrics will respond differently and some can't be pressed at all. So take a look at the type of fabric and test it out before you use this method. Another technique that you can use if your fabric doesn't respond well to being pinned, if you start pinning it and you notice that your fabric is snagging, you might want to do a different type of marking of the pattern piece and then cutting it out. So for this one, I am just going to set this on this fabric. Now you could, for this is just a taffeta, an inexpensive taffeta fabric. You could still fold this for double thickness and do the same technique, but for here I just have one layer. I have my bodice back positioned on the fabric, and I could use a pattern weight or just my hand because this one's pretty small. I hold this, I have the tailor's chalk, and this is in this little rolling tool, and you can hear this click as it's used, and I'm going to go around the perimeter edge of this pattern piece. And I'm doing it with enough pressure that I'm marking it, but light enough that I'm not shifting the fabric. Now I can set something else on here to hold my outside edge, and that should help the fabric that's pulling a tiny bit. So once I have my piece marked on the fabric, then I can go ahead and either just cut it out right along those lines with my rotary cutter, just being careful not to put my fingers on the chalk because it will rub off and then I won't be able to see it. You could also lift up the whole piece and cut this out with scissors now because there will be no shifting in the fabric. You just cut right along these lines. Here we have a large variety of different specialty fabrics. You can see some sample garments over on the left, and then spread out from the middle to the right are a variety of different pieces. At the bottom we have some mesh and tulle. Then moving over here to the right, we have some polyester blend Dupioni fabric. So this is designed and made to look like silk Dupioni, but it's not as expensive. It's a much less expensive fabric. It's frequently used in home decor type projects, but it works as a substitute for silk if you don't want to pay that price. Over here in the center, we do have silk Dupioni and some shanting, which is a different version of a silk Dupioni. So those are beautiful. They're much more expensive, usually about $45 a yard. So when you're working with those fabrics, you do want to make sure that you've tested your pattern, fit, and garment, every part of it, with an inexpensive fabric before you cut into that fabric to avoid any mistakes. And then up to the upper right, we have some sequined fabrics. This is great for overlays, for skirts, bubble skirts, circle skirts, a large variety of type. It also works great for dance costumes, princess dresses. It is really, really versatile. And then in the center, we have a couple varieties of chiffon fabrics. So these are great for tops, dresses, skirts. They're very delicate. They're very sheer. So you can see here, this one has like a sequined overlay on it, like little sequins that are glued down to this fabric, but it is sheer, it's drapeable, it's very lightweight. It also frays really easily. This fabric would snag quite a bit if sewn with the wrong needle. So this is the type where using that sharp needle comes into play. It works best on this type of fabric. So we have a few varieties of that. Some of these you can recognize from some early Liberty Jane pieces. This one we used in the Abercrombie & Fries top. And this one right here is what we used in the Kalara dress. So you can see this fabric is actually printed with a stripe pattern blocked out with different designs. And we just laid this out with the pattern pieces to use this in the most effective way possible. So some of this was cut for the bodice. We cut the skirt along this line so that we had what looked like a striped edge along the bottom of that skirt design, which emphasized that high-low skirt design really nicely. Another fabric in this type of collection that I like to use frequently is a stretch mesh, which is what this blue fabric is right here. It's like tulle, but it's much softer, drapier, and it is stretchy. So you can use it at the top of a bodice that has a sheer overlay or underlay. We've done that on several different designs, as well as in the picture day skirt. We've used this type of fabric, and it has a very good drape and bounce. It works really well for the ruffles. You can cut it, it doesn't fray, so that makes it really easy to work with. Overall, it's a really good one to have on hand, and if you can find it in a variety of colors, that is a plus, because then you can mix and match it and coordinate it with some of the designs that need to have that on the upper bodice as an underlay or an overlay. And here are a few examples of some of these fabrics in use, just so you can get a better idea just for how they work and how they lay, and why drape is important when you are choosing your fabrics and choosing your linings and all of that. So with this design, it is in this orchid color. We've used a shantung fabric, which is silk. It's very lightweight, so it rolls over onto itself very nicely, even once it was lined. So I have just a simple lining here. It's lightweight enough that it doesn't affect the shape or the drape of this skirt. So you can see that here. Now I've gone ahead in this one, it's not finished yet. It has a longer skirt in the back. It's a high-low skirt design that will drape down nicely, and this one gives me the ability to choose fabrics for the inside to either accent this skirt hemline, or it can be self-lined and it wouldn't stand out as much. But I can have a contrasting lining under here. I could actually use like a lace or something, so some of the color would show through from the underside, but it would have a very interesting texture and contrast on this inside of the skirt. Now on this upper part, I haven't finished it yet. I still have the sleeves to finish, and I've been playing with an overlay design for the bodice. So this one I've overlaid this sequined tulle, and this came already embroidered in sequin like this. So this one was pretty delicate. I cut it out. I sewed it in by machine along the neckline in between the bodice and the lining. But for the whole rest of it, I'm going to need to hand sew it down because it's pretty problematic to try to sew this by machine I have to remove the beads or try to sew around them, or I would be breaking the needles. So to get the placement that I want, I'm going to finish these arm's eyes with either edges turned under, and I'll hand sew that, or I'll do some sort of binding technique on the inside that will cover that seam on the inside. But like I said, this one is that shanting fabric. It's very pretty, it's very delicate, and it has a very nice drape. Now on this blue version, this is actually a much less expensive taffeta fabric. Now this is not silk taffeta, it's just taffeta, a polyester blend. It was not very expensive, I think about $8 a yard, but I can use it to create a very similar look. And I've chosen here to self-line this whole entire dress so that the drape of this would still lay and hang nicely. This one actually is a little bit puffier than the shanting, so I do prefer the other fabric for that reason, for the skirt line, but it still provides a very beautiful high-end look when the whole thing is completed. And on this one, I've taken a piece of lace fabric that was embroidered, and I've cut all of these pieces out in portioned sections, and I've been hand sewing them down around the bodice and up around this back side, and I'm gonna sew a few more pieces to finish it off. I have one down at the bottom, which actually helps to weigh down the back of the skirt so it's not so puffy. It holds the shape nicely, and it helps work with this type of fabric. So although this is decorative, it's also functional, and it helps me to be able to shape and weight the skirt in places where I want it to tuck and fold. So that's sort of a hidden technique inside the creative process of how we've put this dress together. Now another thing to note on this design is that because the skirt is lined, I don't have to hem the bottom. This seam is sewn and then it's turned right side out, and it pulls the lining up under the skirt. So that makes that very easy to finish, whether you're using taffeta, if you're using organza, silk dupioni, any type of fabric like that. You're not concerned with a finish hem as much as you are just in your choice of lining. And the same goes for the neckline and the interior finish of the whole dress. The lining helps enclose all those seams so I don't have any raw edges exposed anywhere. Now another fabric that I just wanted to show you is this one, which is the opening night dress, and this is sewn in a stretch taffeta. Now this was inexpensive. It's very pretty. It has a very pretty silver lavender look to it. I love the color and the style of this whole dress, and it worked fine for this pattern, but I do want to show you the difference in the drape of this design. So you can see that this skirt is much puffier. It doesn't really fold on itself. So if you look at the hemline, and I wanted to achieve something like this other dress, it doesn't stay very nicely. The lining on here is also very soft. I think this would have performed a little bit better if I would have done an underlay or a little bit crisper lining that could have helped shape this taffeta on the top, because you don't want to press that to hold this pleat, but it also, the fabric is so strong that it pushes the pleat open, and I don't get that full look that I got when I made this dress out of a Dupioni fabric. So that's just a look at comparing fabrics and your choice of fabric in the dress design that you're working on. And then I have a few other more simple designs using these fabrics, and it kind of elevates the design. So we have a bubble skirt sewn with chiffon fabric and just a standard inexpensive lining on the inside, but all the seams are enclosed, and this finishes this off nicely, but gets a very delicate finish to a very simple pattern. And here we have the California cami. This was one of the first early designs that we did. This one is also a very delicate chiffon fabric. We've hemmed it, we've double ruffled it here so that it's not quite so see-through, and the ruffles just sit one a little bit shorter than the other, and it adds a little bit of texture. So this fabric here is very, very feminine, very pretty, and it was a very nice way to add a little bit of an interesting texture to something that could have been simple if it was made out of something like a woven cotton. And you'll notice too, this is a lot of fabric. So this lays very soft. It has a very soft drape. If this was made out of a woven cotton, it would probably stand out pretty firmly and sort of poof out a little bit more and just not look like something that you'd actually see a little girl wearing. Now here's a fun one. This one we did, this is one of the first Liberty Jane designs that we did. It was called Pretty in Pink, and it is just a basic jacket. We used a hot pink satin, and I actually lined the inside with a pair of tights. So when you're looking around for stuff, just keep your eyes open. There is so much stuff because the pattern pieces are so small. You can use fabric from a variety of places. It doesn't have to be cut off the bolt. So this was a pair of tights in the little girls section, and when I saw it, I knew this would be a perfect way to kind of add that spunky, like punch wow factor to the inside of this jacket. So we've lined the inside, and it's just a simple jacket done in a hot pink satin fabric. Now we've gone over a variety of fabrics that fit into this specialty, slippery, delicate type fabric. So with most of these, we are going to be using this 7010 sharp needle on your machine and a standard presser foot. There might be a few in which they're going to require a little bit different tool, and I'll touch on that in just a second. Now, one of the best resources that I've come across is this book by Dana Willard. It's called Fabrics A to Z, and this is literally the best resource you could have for understanding fabric, what to do with it, what to use it for, how to sew with it, how to care for it. It is an amazing book. It's got every type of fabric in here laid out in a way that is just very helpful. So here's an example, and you can see this is the Dupioni shantung fabric, and it talks about the origin of the fabric, the properties of this fabric, considerations to keep in mind when you're working with it, what type of needle to use, what type of sewing machine feet, your stitch length, just everything. If it needs interfacing, what type of interfacing you're going to want, how to care for that fabric, and so on. It talks about that with every type of fabric: knits, wools, polyester, man-made, anything like that is in this book. So this is an amazing resource, and I highly recommend it. So when it comes to this shantung or Dupioni fabric, you're going to use this needle, which is a 7010. You can also use a universal needle. I would just test it out and make sure that it's nice and sharp. Do a few test stitches and make sure you don't see any snags pull in the fabric. It'll be really obvious, and then you'll know if that needle is going to work or not. Now, when you're thinking about chiffon fabrics, the same type of needle is recommended. You can also use a universal needle, but that sharp needle I think definitely makes a difference and is more important to have for this type of fabric. You'll also just use your standard straight stitch with your standard machine presser foot, and then the stitch length for both of these, 2mm, 2.5mm, works great. Another great resource to have when working with these types of fabrics is a throat plate that has a single hole in it, not the wide opening that comes on the throat plate standard on most machines. So you can look around to see if you can find one for your machine. This allows the needle to press down through that throat plate in that small single hole, so it won't pull your fabric or push your fabric down under the throat plate, which happens frequently with specialty fabrics, with knits. All of those can benefit from that, but you can't sew with a zigzag stitch. So just keep in mind that that works with a straight stitch and might work better for your project, but you just need to make sure that you know exactly what you're doing and when you need to switch that out. Now, fabrics like satins and taffeta. Taffeta is very crisp, you can hear that, and the satin it's crisp, but it's also shiny. Taffeta is usually more of a matte finish, and these ones have like a two-tone effect to them, which is really pretty and adds a little bit of dimension. Now, these are sewn with the same needle, same stitch length, same presser foot. It's all very similar when working with these types of fabrics. Organza fabric is very much the same, sewn in the same way, same needle, same presser foot, all of that. The only thing to keep in mind with organza, there's a variety of types. This one's a little bit more textured with some sparkle. It's usually sheer, you can see through it, so it will need to be lined or backed with an underlay. It also comes in a variety of types. There can be silk organza, which is much more expensive, or just a polyester synthetic nylon type organza, which is less expensive, and you can use those in a variety of princess style costume, something that you want a big effect with a nice glimmery type of fabric, that works really well. And you just want to make sure that you're using your sharp needle on that one too. Now, another type of fabric that I didn't mention at the beginning is velvet. So velvet comes in a variety of types. If you're working with a traditional velvet, you can find a silk velvet or some that are made out of other fibers like rayon, polyester, even a spandex, which is much more versatile than a traditional velvet. Now, most of these you cannot machine wash, but the spandex microfiber type velvet can be washed, so that's good, and you can do stretchy type dresses, shirts, pants for the dolls, which is fun, and it also has a more sort of crushed velvet look to it. Now, with real silk velvets, you need to store them hanging so that they don't get any damage. Folding them will permanently crease them. You want to be careful and keep that in mind. Now, with the velvet, you can also use the sharp needle 7010, or you can go up a size to a larger 8012, depending on the thickness or the type of velvet that you've chosen. You also will probably want to use a walking foot because this fabric tends to shift and slip around as it's being sewn, especially when it's right sides together and the pile edges are on top of each other. Another thing to note too when cutting this out is that velvet has nap, just like corduroy. So you want to make sure that your pieces are all going in the same direction along the grain line. For example, if you were going to make velvet pants, you wouldn't want to put the front piece with the top at the top of the fabric and then flip to fit better and have your back upside down, because when those pants get sewn together, your nap is going to push in the opposite direction and it will actually look almost like a different color. So you just want to keep that in mind when working with this type of fabric. Velvet is also easily damaged when trying to pull out seams. So you want to just double check your pattern and the fit, everything that you're doing before you begin sewing, just to prevent that from happening so that you don't have to take out any stitching. And another tip for working with velvet, if your walking foot is not pulling it through evenly and there's still some shifting going on when the fabric is going through the machine, you can take double-sided quilter's tape. I have some that's 1/8 of an inch wide. You could probably use 1/4 inch wide as well. You just want to be really careful that you know where that ends so that you don't sew through it and you're sewing just past it on your seam allowance marking line. So you would put that double-sided tape on the edge of your fabric, and then when you fold those sides together and you have right sides together, you have that tape just along the edge and it's holding that in the seam allowance, and then you're stitching just past that to do your stitch line, and that will really help hold that fabric together as it's being pushed through. But the help of the walking foot will pull from the top while the feed dogs are pulling from the bottom, and you should have a consistent result of a smooth, even seam that isn't shifting one piece down on top of the other. When working with a sequined or beaded fabric, you're going to need to look at how the fabric is constructed. For the most part, the base fabric, if it's tulle or if it's a knit, if it's a velvet, depending on what it is, will determine the needle type that you're going to use. It could be a universal needle, a stretch needle, a sharp needle. It really just depends on the base fabric that is the underlaying piece of that design. Now, with most of these fabrics, the sequins are pliable and soft enough to sew through if they're flush and flat on the fabric. But something like this that has more of a beaded technique, there are actual beads sewn on here as well as some flat sequins. You just want to carefully place your pattern piece on here, and then once you have it cut out, you'll just want to go ahead and remove beads that fall into that seam allowance line and just take them off, and then you can easily sew with a machine. If you're trying to keep as many as you can, then you can hand stitch your seams, but that takes a lot more precision and a lot more time. Now, it's still a good idea to test the sequin fabric on your machine because I've had plenty of needles break when sewing with these types of fabrics. The first thing to keep in mind is that your needle is going to dull fairly quickly because it is sewing through this. So if you have a new sharp needle, universal, stretch, or sharp, it will sew probably pretty well at the beginning, but you'll notice it will start to have a little bit of resistance as it gets to certain points, and you might just want to change your needle. But for the most part, these fabrics add a bunch of glitz and glam to what you're working on, and they're not that hard to sew with. So when you find them, it's a good idea to scoop them up, and then you can work them into some designs, either bodice overlays or bubble skirt portion of a dress, something like that. It adds a lot of sort of that wow factor to your design and really kind of elevates it, takes it to the next level. And one last thing to keep in mind with this is I would not iron this. So if you have any pressing that needs to happen on your garment, if it's made in a fabric that can be pressed and this is going on top, say it's taffeta or it's the Dupioni or something like that, just make sure you have all your pressing done first and then put this fabric and apply this to your garment. You can go through and finger press the areas that need to have seams open or that type of thing. Okay, so those are the tips and tricks that I know for working with these types of fabrics. I hope this is a good resource for you. And remember, you can refer back to this video at any time that you feel stuck or you can't remember exactly what needle or what pinning technique to use with these types of fabrics.